Imagine you're looking at an official map of the world. Not a modern one from the 1700s, drawn by the royal cartographers of France and England. The most accurate maps money can buy at the time. You find Asia, and sitting right in the middle of it, covering most of the continent, is a territory labeled in big letters, Tartaria. Grand Tartary, one of the largest labeled empires on the entire map. And it's not on one map. It's on hundreds of them, produced by different countries over 300 years. Official documents used by governments and navies and kings. Now think about every history class you've ever sat through, every documentary, every book they handed you in school. Did anyone ever once mention Tartaria to you? Because it's on every single one of those maps. But it's in none of our history. That gap is what this video is about, and once you see it, you're not going to be able to unsee it. Now, this isn't one map. This isn't one cartographer who made a mistake and had an agenda. We're talking about hundreds of official maps produced over 3 centuries by the best map makers in the world. Abraham Ortelius, the man who made the first modern atlas in 1570. His maps were the gold standard. Governments used them. Navies used them. Nobody put a fictional empire on the Ortelius Atlas. But Tartaria is on it. Guillaume de Lisle, royal cartographer of the King of France in the 1700s. These weren't decorative maps for rich people to hang on their walls. These were working geopolitical documents used by the French crown to understand the world. Serious maps made by serious people. Tartaria is on those too. The Encyclopedia Britannica, first edition 1768, has a full entry for Tartaria. Describes it as one of the largest territories on Earth with its own population and culture and history. So at some point, somebody needs to explain to me how an empire that size just disappears. Not from the physical world, from the record. No war that history documents, no treaty, no gradual absorption into another empire that we can trace. It's just there on the maps and then it's not. And here's what really gets me. The territory is still on the maps after Tartaria disappears. They didn't redraw the borders. They didn't fill it with something else. They just stopped labeling it. Like someone went through and quietly replaced the name but forgot to replace it with anything else. And then I started looking at the buildings that were still standing in that territory. And that's when this went from interesting to something I genuinely couldn't explain. The Missouri State Capitol, the British Museum in London, the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow, the old post office in Washington, D.C., the Opera House in Odessa, Ukraine, the Central Railway Station in Milan. Different countries, different decades supposedly, different builders, different cultures. Go look at the photographs of all of them side by side. They are the same building. Not the same style in a general way, the same building. Same proportions, same columns, same windows, same roof lines, same everything. Like whoever designed all of them was working from one set of plans that somehow ended up on opposite sides of the planet. The official answer is that European classical architecture spread globally through trade and colonialism. And sure, that can explain some of it. But it doesn't explain why a building in Uzbekistan and a building in Chicago and a building in Melbourne all look like they were built by the same person who had never left his desk. But here's a detail that kind of got me. A lot of these buildings have their ground floors underground. Walk up to them today and what should be the main entrance, what the architecture clearly intends to be the ground floor, with the big windows and the grand doorways, is buried, sitting below the current street level. Windows that look out at dirt, doors that open into walls. But nobody wrote down why. There are no records of a deliberate decision to bury the lower floors of hundreds of buildings across multiple continents. There aren't any engineering documents explaining why the ground level of so many major cities is significantly higher than it was when those buildings were constructed. It's just buried, and nobody talks about it. The people who research this call it the mud flood, and once you start seeing it, you'll find it everywhere. And the question it raises is not a small one. Go to Edinburgh, Scotland, and book a tour of the Edinburgh Vaults. You'll walk through an entire city that is underground. Streets, buildings, doorways, all completely intact. All buried under the modern city. And the tour guides will tell you how it got there, and the explanation is, well, not very satisfying, honestly. They'll tell you about gradual construction over centuries and the city building up on top of itself. What they won't tell you is why it happened the same way in so many other places, because Edinburgh is not unique, not even close. In cities across Central Asia, the old Tartaria territory, there are buildings sitting partially underground that people living there now can't explain. Structures with architectural details that don't belong to any culture currently in that region. Buildings with columns, archways, and windows that point to something far more sophisticated than what history says was there. Old photographs from American cities from the mid to late 1800s show street levels that are dramatically lower than where they are today. Same buildings, same neighborhoods, but the ground is several feet lower than it is in the photographs taken just decades later. What the mud flood theory proposes is that at some point, and the evidence points to somewhere in the 1800s, a catastrophic event deposited a significant layer of materials across large parts of the inhabited world, burying lower floors, raising street levels, covering an entire layer of civilization that subsequent generations just built on top of. Is that proven? No, absolutely not. But the buried floors are real. The photographs are real. The missing explanation is real. And when you put it together with the maps and the buildings, it starts pointing somewhere uncomfortable. Because the physical evidence is only half of this. The other half is what happened to the people, and the population records from this period are, to put it plainly, very strange. Look at the major cities of North America in the early 1800s. St. Louis, Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit. On paper, these are small frontier settlements, rough places, a few thousand people scratching out a living on the edge of a continent. And then within a few decades, grand buildings, massive infrastructure, railway systems, water systems, public architecture that rivals anything in Europe. Built supposedly by a frontier population that did not have the craftsmen, the resources, or the accumulated architectural knowledge to produce any of it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's fast. Suspiciously fast. And the buildings they produce look identical to the buildings in countries they had almost no contact with. Now look at the world fairs. Now look at the world's fairs. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The St. Louis World's Fair of 1904. Enormous complexes of the most significant classical buildings you have ever seen. Constructed supposedly in just a couple of years for a temporary exhibition. Then demolished the moment the fair ended. Why would you build something that magnificent and tear it down? Some researchers in this space argue, and I'm not saying that they're right, I'm saying the argument is worth sitting with, that those buildings were not built for the fairs. They were already there. The fairs were a way of explaining why all this grand architecture suddenly existed in cities where they were supposedly frontier towns a generation earlier. And if you look at photographs of those fair buildings and then look at the permanent buildings at the same era in the same cities, same materials, same style, same level of craftsmanship, as if they came from the same source. And that source, whatever it was, seems to have built things all over the world. In a style so consistent and so specific that the only explanation that fully accounts for it is the one that nobody in mainstream history is willing to seriously consider. There's a building in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Samarkand is the heart of what is labeled Tartaria on those maps. It's in Central Asia, remote, far from the centers of European culture that supposedly produced the classical architectural style we are talking about. The building has columns, arched windows, proportions and decorative details that would not look out of place in London or Paris or Washington, D.C. It should not look like that. The culture that supposedly built it didn't have a tradition of building like that at all. There's no architectural lineage that explains how a building in Uzbekistan ended up looking like it belongs to the National Mall. But it does. And it's not alone. Across the territory that used to be labeled Tartaria, there are structures that share this architectural language. Buildings that look like they belong to a connected civilization. A civilization that built consistently and ambitiously across a vast territory. And here's what I keep coming back to. Every one of the ancient civilizations that this channel's covered, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, they all appeared suddenly, fully formed, with knowledge and capability that should have taken thousands of years to develop. And they all said the same thing about where that knowledge came from. It was given to them by someone who came before. What if Tartaria is not an ancient civilization in the way we usually mean? What if it's more a recent one? What if the thing that was erased was not thousands of years ago, but just a few hundred years ago? Recent enough that the buildings are still standing. Recent enough that the maps survived. Recent enough that if you look in the right places, you can still find evidence of what was there. And what happened to it? The leading theories are the part of this that I find the most disturbing of all. Nobody knows. That is the honest answer, and I think it's important to say it before I tell you what people think. The evidence points toward a significant event sometime in the 1800s. Something that affected large parts of the world simultaneously. That buried a layer of existing civilization. That allowed a new historical narrative to be written on top of what came before. Some researchers connect it to a natural catastrophe. A continuation of the pattern we talked about in a video I have coming up about the Younger Dryas period. Civilization building, catastrophe hitting. The survivors starting over and inheriting fragments of what came before without fully understanding where those fragments came from. Some connect it to a deliberate erasure. That Tartaria was not destroyed by nature, but absorbed and then written out of history by the powers that replaced it. That the maps survived because they were too widely distributed to collect. That the buildings survived because they cannot exactly hide a building. But the historical narrative, the story of what Tartaria was, that was successfully removed. Now I don't know which one of those is right. What I do know is what's real. The maps, the buildings, the buried floors, the World's Fair photographs, the architectural consistency across continents and cultures. All that's real. And the gap between all that physical evidence and what we were taught in school is the gap that has never been satisfactorily explained. Something was there. Something happened to it. And we're living in the world that was built on top of it. Now, I'm not going to sit there and tell anybody what to conclude about all of this, but the evidence is there. If this one got in your head and you want to dig into it a little bit more, start with the maps. Pull them up yourself. You don't need to take my word for any of this. The evidence is sitting there in public archives waiting for anyone who thinks to look. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate your time. Please subscribe and drop a comment on this video. What do you think about this one? It's kind of nutty, to be honest with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Till next time, I'll talk to you later.